So this will be a slightly different presentation compared to what we saw earlier, because in the other three presentations, we see development of solutions. And in this one, we want to look at some trends in terms of how these solutions are diffused in the world, the governance systems that enable them, that motivate companies to adopt them. So we look more at the politics, the governance, rather than the technological content. So as Charlotte says, I have a bit of mea culpa, so I criticize and engage with these regimes, but in my past professional life, I developed them. So the Access to Medicine Index that I'll be mentioning in my presentation, I was the project manager for it from 2009 to 2012, Access to Nutrition Index, Responsible Mining Index, various indices that try to influence corporate behavior. So I'm going to be talking about this rise of these private regulatory forms, a really weird type of doing regulation. It's not state anymore. There is a lot of regulatory entrepreneurship, some motivated people taking it upon themselves, finding funding, starting an organization, issuing a ranking or rating of some large corporations, single-handedly trying to change the rule of the games among some very large and powerful actors. You're dealing with this probably in your different sectors in the form of various labels, multi-stakeholder initiatives, FTSE for Good Index. You might be, these ecosystems have emerged in the past 30 years, and they're there to stay, and it's part of your company's day-to-day operations to deal with them, but also make them useful in the way you run your businesses and you engage with environmental and social matters. So I've recently joined University of Edinburgh, and one of the things that I've discovered at the business school is BCAS. The director of is Sarah Ivory, and it's a group of around 12 academics from the business school and 20 plus academics that are associates. It's focused essentially on engaging with policy, research-enabled policy discussions on market aspects, the government side of things, the organizational side of things, community and individual side of things, and also offering new teaching packages and various masters, and enabling essentially a more effective training for future leaders to deal with these issues. So with that, I'll get to my topic. So as I said, it's about the rise of a type of non-nation state transnational private regulators. These weird small entities that try to influence corporations. We're moving from states' hard forms of regulation because states have sanctioning power. They can go after the firm and they can impose fines and various types of sanctioning type motivations that would move the companies towards compliance. In the past 50 years, we've had also a large ecosystem of intergovernmental organizations, post-Second World War, the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and on and on. And now we talk about this private modes of corporate, environmental, social, and governance regulation, such as multi-stakeholder initiatives, CSR labels, sustainability listings, various indicators and scores, and each large company, but also smaller ones, they deal with hundreds of data requests. So I talked recently, for example, head of the global policy at Sanofi Aventis, which is a pharmaceutical company. He says on average, we have 120 data requests that they want to evaluate us, and they ask for data on environmental and social and governance matters, and we don't know how to respond to this large ecosystem of private regulators. These are some examples: Access to Nutrition Index, Access to Seeds Index, Responsible Mining, and this Rainforest Alliance. Some of them are on governance, some of them are on environmental matters, and some of them are on social matters. So these technologies that we discuss here, one way they could be diffused is being adopted by these initiatives in their evaluations of the corporations, and as a result, creating motivations for adoption across various industries. It could be in the form of a label on a product for a new type of plastic that would enable customer backing for such products and motivate the companies to adopt this technology. It could be in the form of informing investors, informing regulators, informing various actors to motivate the companies to change. So essentially, they're all initiatives of a small private organization. The majority, they're a new type of regulator that's about 10 people, 5 people, 15 people coming to change the rules of the game. So they don't have the sanctioning power, and stability of the nation state. They struggle to find funding. This is not state-like. They have to go and talk to Gates Foundation, the UK government, the Dutch government, US aid to find funding to do governance. They get involved in contested fields, areas where there is a fight going on, whether it's patents in pharmaceutical industry, whether it's healthy food in the nutrition sector, or whether it's, for example, it's matters related to indigenous rights in the mining sector, or, and we can continue like that. So it's contested fields where debate a lot of times is broken down and there's a lot of conflictual and lots of litigations going on. What's interesting about this new ecosystem is that it's dominantly funded by very few funding organizations. So the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the UK government, and the Swiss government are the three European development agencies heavily invested in governance. In the US, it's dominantly the US foundations, such as the Gates Foundation, but also the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundation. So there are maybe 10 of them globally who drive this movement. So compared to intergovernmental organizations where all the states would have some sort of membership, here we have a narrowing down of influence of funders. And definitely the non-Western world has no say in this space. There is no development agency from China. It's not yet in their strategic trajectory to invest in governance. So it's, as I said, the UK government has been very influential before that DFID in this space. They all do some sort of a stakeholder consultation simply because they have no mandate. They have no vote, they haven't been voted in, so they do stakeholder deliberation, try to get them to some sort of consensus to have a backing for their environmental and social agenda and interventions. They don't have sanctioning power, so they entice, they motivate, so that companies will accept their agenda and would act on their own. So it's a very different type of regulation that you don't want to see. You can't sanction, so you try to appeal to your target, you try to excite your targets, you try to make them, for example, compete against the other companies in the sector so that change would happen in the industry. So they mobilize reputational processes for compliance, and they use various devices, rankings, ratings, heat maps, scores, league tables, on and on, to motivate this competitive urge among companies. But there's an example that I was heavily involved in before, and I've done research on in the past number of years. It's a ranking of big pharma. So these are the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. It's a little NGO from the Netherlands, a guy, Wim Leerveld, who started this NGO. They put some people together. They did a stakeholder consultation in 2005, 2006. They put a ranking out there. It's taken up by the media very quickly because they love rankings because there are winners and losers. And in the space of 10, 15 years, they've become a very important platform with no public mandate, however, very influential in the space of defining the agenda for big pharma in the space of access to medicine. So they do it every 2 years. This is the 6th one that was recently released, and that's the first one from Access to Medicine Index 2008. As you can see, they have to keep the game dynamic. So from each index to the next one, they need some movements to create news. Otherwise, rankings would die. So these are the specific dynamics of these type of devices. They have to show some improvement to create hope, but also some gap. Because if there is no gap, there is no competitive urge. If there is no improvement, there is no hope. So these balancing acts define a lot what they show us. So there is some claim to describing the world, but in practice, to be a good ranking, they have to balance lots of pressures, and they have to adapt themselves in various ways to the way they are consumed. This one, it covers 106 countries and 82 diseases. So they are very global. Even if they're national, their target populations are vast. And they're very small, so they're heavily challenged. So you see these labels on all the products that you use every day, by the way. So besides your work in your various companies, you also deal with this as a customer. Sometimes you deal with this as investors. So these labels and these organizations are really ubiquitous and very present in our day-to-day lives. So they have to project difference between leaders and laggards, because if there is no difference, there is no competition. So if there's not enough difference, they squeeze difference out of the data to project that. This one is funded by the Gates Foundation, the Dutch and UK government, and one charitable trust, and one investor, AXA Investment Management, and the Wellcome Trust from the UK. So again, this shows the ecosystem of influence in the space of private governance. And it's become very influential, and companies react to it. So when you look at the big pharma CSR reports, they highlight their positioning, they set target for themselves. In the next index, we want to move our positions, for example, by 2 positions. And some of them, even they disclose their activities based on the methodology of this ranking. So some of them manage to be very successful in getting corporate attention, and sometimes even motivating actions and new initiatives. So they do it every 2 years, 1 year of stakeholder consultation and getting to some sort of consensus, 1 year of development of the index and release of the index. You have to do it in multiple iterations, otherwise it wouldn't work. Companies should know that it's not a one-time thing, and they will be in this game in the long run, otherwise they won't play this game. So that's one of the rules of this type of regulation. This is an example of stakeholder consultation. So bringing people together from various actors, having a chair that would run the show, trying to get consensus. That actually never happens, because when you deal with matters such as access to medicines, on patents and equitable pricing, there is no way to get it to a common ground, simply because there is entrenched, even legalized position. The industry would never accept waiving patent rights for certain types of medicines. And the generics industry also would not accept patent extensions, for example, for certain diseases. So on patents and especially equitable pricing, these are areas where the positions would never be reconciled. However, and the last thing is that bringing the patient to the table, bringing the beneficiary to the table is always very difficult, because patients are diverse. In this case, we're talking about 5 billion people, 82 diseases. So the patient remains as a photo on this report, which is the 2021 report. It's visualized everywhere. Everybody talks about the patient, but we never really effectively engage with the beneficiaries because they're far away, they're messy, they don't speak the governance lingo, and as a result, they're not really equipped to be part of this game. So in the absence of public mandate, these labels rely on projection of consensus, even though that consensus is never really happens, so it's always a negotiated outcome rather than really aligning positions. They consult a small public, because the more radical actors, for example, in the case of Access to Medicine Index, Doctors Without Borders will never accept to play the game, because they say, this is not the way we deal with the industry. We take them to court, and we use hard regulation. This type of competitive game for them is a smokescreen. It distracts rather than actually bring effective regulation. So these actors stays out. And of course, the target populations also would be always very difficult to bring to the table. So this is the change theory. So each one of them, this is interesting language, has a change theory, how we want to change the targets. For this Access to Medicine Index, they want to inform investors, so that investors would put pressure on the companies. They would inform governments, and these ones they emphasize less. Investors themselves and companies are much more highlighted, so they inform investors so that shareholder engagement with change companies, and they inform companies so that they can learn from each other with the objective of providing access to medicine to the patients. So this is how they inform investors. This is the collective of investors worth something like $11 trillion, backing their agenda, so they go after them one by one, getting them to sign up to their letter so that they would back the agenda of the index and use it in their portfolio management and in their shareholder engagement. You have a range of from pension funds to mainstream asset managers to more SRI-type asset managers to insurance firms from across the globe. USS, for example, is down there, which is our own pension fund. And this is heavily projected on the foundation's website so that the companies see it, because when the companies know that investors are looking, then they start to react. Another one is...
Just one word about that is before the Access to Medicine Index came along, your best strategy as a pharma company was to never work on infectious diseases and promise that if you accidentally discovered something, it would be free. And then the poor companies that were working on infectious diseases would be under pressure that, oh, if you discover something, you should lose lots of money by giving it away for free. Because now we're actually go in and say, oh, you get credit for working on these areas if you have appropriate tiered pricing where the rich countries pay back most of the R&D, the middle income pay back some of the R&D, and the poorest countries get marginal cost pricing and pay back none of the R&D. Now, you know, the relative rankings in this index, because people are competing as they want to employ smart kids, the relative rankings have improved quite dramatically. And you know, we meet with the pharmaceutical CEOs, the CEO of pharmas on a regular basis. We have a face-to-face meeting with all of them. You know, they're disappointed when their ranking isn't very good, and that's competition and excellence that we're super happy to see.
So essentially, when you're not the state, when you're these small actors, you have to bring in the gaze of other actors so that your targets would behave. So kind of a game of gazes, you have to invite investors and you show the companies that investors are looking. In the pharmaceutical sector, Gates Foundation is very important. So you put this video on your website and make sure companies are aware that Gates is using this device. And in the process, you motivate your targets to behave. So these organizations aggregate and project the gaze of powerful and loud actors upon companies. Investors, customers are typical. So these are the two key actors, and other petty sovereigns, which is sovereigns with no mandate, such as the Gates Foundation. They normally don't invite more radical actors because conflict doesn't help with motivating the targets, so they bring in more consensual types of power that are integral to the capitalist system, so more radical NGOs are not normally invited. Southern governments, for example, because of their conflictual relation to the industry, they're not actively informed. The actors that are actively informed is dominantly investors and customers at the expense of the others. And to sustain the gaze, as I said earlier, you have to have a good balance of stability and change over iteration, not too stable. Too much change, it's not realistic. It's not possible to understand the rationality of this device. Too stable, there's no action, there is no news. And a balance between improvement, but also remaining gap. So I find this, just to change the mood, a very interesting, I think, analogy. So this painting is by Velázquez, is from the 17th century. There's been a very nice analysis of it by a French philosopher called Michel Foucault in the first chapter of a book called The Order of Things, about where sovereignty lies. What we see here is, well, that's, actually I have a pointer, that's Velázquez himself painting, and we don't know what he's painting. He's actually looking at us, because we've won that. So the painting, it starts to engage us. What is he painting? We see everybody is looking in front of the canvas. So this absence, that's the structure, we ask ourselves who it is, and finally we see a mirror back here. And in this mirror we see the sovereign, the king and the queen of Spain. So okay, it seems like Velázquez is painting the king and queen of Spain. And by the way, there is a second Velázquez here. It's the cousin of the Velázquez. He's totally irrelevant to this story. But it is actually the two roles of Velázquez, the painter, painting the present and guiding us to the future, a door, a bright door out there, which is like a ranking device, painting the present and the past, and guiding us to the future. And you know what? Now we know that if you do a spatial analysis of this painting, this mirror is not positioned in a way that it could show in the front of the canvas. Actually, it's reflecting the painting itself. So essentially, this is a self-referential system. And we don't know, it doesn't matter what's actually in front of the canvas, which is like beneficiaries. So when we talk about patients in the case of access to medicine, or consumers in the case of access to nutrition index, everybody talks about them. Everybody is looking at them. The ranking tries to paint their benefits and their interest. In practice, they're never to be seen. And it's a self-referential system in which the idea of the access to medicine need, for example, is projected back and forth between these governance actors. It gets concrete increasingly, and we don't see where is the life conditions on the ground, where are the patients themselves. So I will finish with a few points. It's a fascinating era of privatization of governance, moving regulation from states and intergovernmental organizations to private, fragile, underfunded actors, funded dominantly by a small subset of Western funders. They're optimized for intervention, which means that their informing qualities are challenged. Each time we see a ranking, we shouldn't just believe in these differences. We should think of how is this device optimized for intervention? how are the distances sometimes squeezed out of companies that are not that different simply because this is how these devices get relevance and operate. They frequently mobilize market discipline, financial markets and investors, but also customers over the targets. It means that other types of stakeholders with more conflictual relations with the industry are left out. And the beneficiaries and their needs, as we saw in the painting by Velasquez also as an analogy, they're seen at a very high distance from these devices with a risk of detachment from people's living conditions. And I will stop there. Thank you.